What's up, my dogs? Hey, dude skis, help me out a little bit here, boys. I think I have like, I don't know, 980 something followers. Oh my God. Keep it on the track, Spency boy. I think I have like 980 something followers on Instagram. Come on, guys. Give me to 1,000 here. Let's get her to 1,000. My Instagram is just Spencer Turley, no spaces and no capital letters. You'll see it because it's the same profile picture thing as my YouTube logo shit, right? The purple galaxy Spency boy. Okay, so anyways, we've got the Supercross games versus the MXGP games. This is quite the clever little video here because I've never really seen anybody else make this exact kind of video. There may be one out there, I'm not really sure. I mean, obviously I've seen the, Supercross 1 versus MXGP Pro and the MXGP 2019 versus Supercross 2 and videos like that, but I've never really seen a video like this. It's comparing the two different types of milestone games, right? So I think that's what kind of separates this video a little bit. Either way, very interesting. And by the way, in this video, I'm not really going to be talking about the first three MXGP games because that was kind of before they even started doing the Supercross games. And that was kind of a whole different, era of the milestone games. And, when they did MXGP 1, 2, and 3, that was kind of like its own little trilogy there. And then they went to the first Supercross game, and then they came out with MXGP Pro, and then Supercross 2, and then MXGP 2019, and Supercross 3, and then MXGP 2020. So that's really what I'm talking about. The three Supercross games versus MXGP Pro, MXGP 2019, and MXGP 2020. That's the main sort of comparison here in this video. So one thing I have noticed about these milestone Supercross games and MXGP games after MXGP 1, 2, and 3, right? I have to kind of remind you because I know a lot of you guys are going to kind of say, well, what about MXGP 3 and shit like that? I'm not even talking about those first three MXGP games, okay? I'm talking about whenever they went to Supercross 1 and then went to MXGP Pro, it almost seems to me like the team sort of either split in a way to where half of the team went to work on, the new Supercross games and the other half of the team stuck around to continue to work on the MXGP games. I don't really know exactly how all that, went down per se, but it just kind of seems to me like something happened there between, when they went from MXGP 3 to the first Supercross game. Something happened internally with Milestone to where it's like somehow they had to like delegate the different developers and things like that in some kind of a way, because it doesn't seem to me like, what I'm trying to get across by saying that is, it doesn't seem to me like the people that work on the Supercross games are the same people that worked on MXGP Pro and MXGP 2019 and MXGP 2020. And if you played all these games, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It just doesn't seem like it's the same people. Obviously, they take certain things from the Supercross games, like, you can definitely feel the similarities with, like, Supercross 1 and MXGP Pro, and then feel the similarities between Supercross 2. I think it's more like you more so feel the similarities between like Supercross 2 and MXGP Pro, I would say. And then you feel the similarities between like, Supercross 3 and MXGP 2020, all the milestone games that came out within that same year, you can definitely feel the similarities between them. But it's always, to me, feels like these MXGP games, since the Supercross games have started coming out, just feel like a step backwards from the Supercross game, straight up. Like, there is really no mistaking, there's really no doubt about it that Supercross 1, 2, and 3 blows MXGP Pro and MXGP 19 and 20 out of the water. Like, there's just no doubt about it. I feel like the Supercross games, excluding, MXGP 1, 2, and 3, just definitely seem to be like better overall experiences, better physics systems, better, just feels like that more advanced milestone game. Feels like they're actually trying to develop their Supercross games into something better, and it just feels like those MXGP, like MXGP Pro, MXGP 2019, all those kind of games just feel like they're kind of like shittier versions of the Supercross games that came out that same year. You know what I mean? They definitely went down some weird roads. The whole MXGP Pro thing was trying to be this like, more realistic. I don't really know what the heck you want to call it, but it ended up turning out being more janky than it ended up being like more skill gapped and realistic. You know what I mean? And then like, it's this bizarre thing of like, you always think these newer MXGP games are going to be like the Supercross game before, but in a motocross, on motocross tracks, and it just never really seems to quite live up to that, in my opinion. Like, MXGP Pro does not feel like, Supercross 1 or Supercross 2 on motocross tracks. It just really doesn't. And MXGP 2020 does not feel like Supercross 3 on motocross tracks. It just really doesn't. Like, there's something missing there in all these different MXGP games. There's just something missing from that Supercross game before, as far as the physics. It just seems like there's always something a little off to it, to me personally. It's just starting to get to that point where it kind of feels to me like these newer MXGP games are just starting to feel like rehashed, half-assed, shittier versions of the Supercross games that come out before them, right? It just seems like they're just like, well, shit, I guess we got to come out with another MXGP game, Like, for instance, with all the improvements that they made with Supercross 3, with the inertia and the hucking and the filling on the bike and the skill gap to the rhythms and everything else that came along with Supercross 3, I just expected so much more out of MXGP 2020 than what we actually got with it. I really did. And MXGP 2019 to me just kind of felt like a step backwards in every way. It honestly did. It just kind of felt like this bizarre, like, what are they doing? They're just going backwards. It kind of felt like it was on this steady incline with skill gap and jump rhythm skill gap and inertia to the bike and filling. Supercross 2 feels more like that than Supercross 1, and then Supercross 3 certainly feels more like that than Supercross 1 and 2, so they were kind of on this, like, steady progression with the the bike filling and everything. And then it just seems like they're just, taking steps backwards when you get to the MXGP games in and amongst all these Supercross games. And the track editors seem to be better overall experiences in these Supercross games than the MXGP games. There's really no doubt about that. I mean, it just, to me, kind of feels like first of all, they didn't even have a track editor in MXGP Pro, so there's one for you. They had a track editor in the first Supercross game, and they don't even have a track editor in the next MXGP game. That was complete bullshit. I don't know what the heck they were doing there. Then they finally come out with the track editor in MXGP 2019, a year later, right? And it doesn't even have like rut module pieces or roughness module pieces or any kind of things you would actually want to put on a custom motocross track. It doesn't have any of that shit. Like this just completely basic bullshit ass track editor for a motocross game. Then we get to, MXGP 2020, and, they try to say there's like all this elevation editing shit, and it just kind of turned out to not really be what they were really portraying on that. But I mean, yeah, like the track editors haven't really improved all that much with the Supercross games. They honestly haven't done much with them. I mean, they've really just added like sand sections and customizable starts and a couple of new little module pieces here and there, but not a whole lot, right? But I would 10 to 1 rather use the track editor of these Supercross games than the track editor of the MXGP games. There's no doubt about that. But Yeah, and as far as the graphics, I mean, they just been kind of steadily increasing that with every milestone games that comes out, you know. So I don't really think like the MXGP series is taking a hit as far as that at all. I think MXGP 2020 looks amazing graphically. I think that's kind of like basically one of the only real positives to MXGP 2020 is the graphics. Feels kind of like to me basically every other aspect of that game is just kind of a step backwards from where where I would expect the game to be, especially after Supercross 3. I think they made some real progression with that game as far as the feeling on the bike and the movement and giving her a little more depth to the actual gameplay and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this. I definitely want to go in there and read up on that a little bit. We'll go to some MXGP 2019 gameplay here. Even the free ride tracks on these newer MXGP games, I feel like don't even come close to the free ride tracks that you have in the Supercross games. Like, I tell you one thing, man, the compound in MXGP 2019 and MXGP 2020, those things are so piss poor and so small jump and so weird ass, like the way they're laid out where you can't really hit any big jumps on them in comparison to like the free ride compound in Supercross 1, 2, and 3. I would 10 to 1 rather ride on the free ride tracks of the Supercross games than the free ride tracks of the MXGP games. There's no doubt about it. And I just feel like it's just like these MXGP games have just started to take the back burner when it comes to milestone games. I feel like there was so much success with the first Supercross game that it feels to me like all of the good people on the milestone team are working on the Supercross games, and it's kind of like all the B-tier type developers and people in the milestone team are working on the MXGP games now just to kind of continue to do it, just to be kind of that extra cash grab. It just kind of feels like what they're doing every year is like they're taking somewhat of the way that previous Supercross games physics system was, and they're just changing it just a little bit, right? And then they're kind of just throwing it in. They're kind of copy and pasting the MXGP tracks that they had in the MXGP game previously, and they kind of just, create a game out of it, right? It's not really like it just doesn't seem to me like they're developing really a proper newer. I mean, yeah, with MXGP 2020, you got a lot better graphics, but in all reality, like, you don't have Ghost in MXGP 2020. You don't have like the wet track mode and the cloudy mode that you had back in MXGP Pro and stuff like that. It just specifically with MXGP 2019 and MXGP 2020, those two games in particular are the ones that's just mind-numbingly boring. Mind-numbingly, like, repetitively the same shit. Like, that's one thing I would say that's the biggest thing about MXGP 2020 and MXGP 2019. They're the most boring milestone games that you're ever gonna play out there, period. Like, straight up, there's no doubt about it. They are the most boring milestone games. MXGP Pro was definitely a janky-filling milestone game, but it wasn't nowhere near as close to being as boring as MXGP 2019 or MXGP 2020. There's just no way. The Supercross games are just getting better and better and better, but I feel like the MXGP games are not just getting better and better and better. They're not, dude. Like, they're not. You're getting tricked up by the graphics, and it's making you think the gameplay is getting better, but when you compare it to, like, Supercross 3's gameplay and Supercross 3's free ride compound and, the movement on Supercross 3 and the jump sizes and the jump skill gap of Supercross 3, MXGP 2020 don't even come close to that, dude. It really don't, which is stupid because it was made in the same year as Supercross 3. It's like, what the hell are they doing? No terrain deformation at all in MXGP 2020, not even visually. Like, there's no doubt about it that they're going backwards in every way other than the graphics with these MXGP games. There's no doubt about it. man. There's just not. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see when Supercross 4 comes out, because I really think they're going to have made quite the progression with that game. I think you're really going to start. It's kind of like every year we look to the new Supercross game to really see the actual improvements with the Milestone franchise, and then you already know the next MXGP game is just going to be some bullshit. It's starting to get to that point where it's like, where I'm starting to like say, like, do not buy the next MXGP game. Just don't do it, man. You can buy the next Supercross game, but don't buy the next MXGP game. They've proven themselves so many times now that these newer MXGP games are just not cutting it, bro. They're just not. When you compare them to the Supercross game that came out earlier that year, they're just not. They're not cutting the cheese anymore, bro. You know what I'm saying? They're just not doing it, man. They're just boring. Like, there's no other way to say it. They're slowing the games down, making it feel like you're in super friction dirt, slowing everything down, making the jump sizes small, 1-to-1 scaling, barely coming off of the ground, you know? It's just ridiculous, man. Oh my gosh, dude. I mean, as soon as I get back to Supercross 3 after playing every single one of these different games, it's just like you can just feel it in the movement. There's just so much more movement on the bike. Left to right steering, it just feels so much more like fluent. You know what I mean? Fluent motion on the bike. Leaning forward and backwards, you know. The games just feel like MXGP Pro and MXGP, you know, 2019 and those kind of games. They just feel so like restricted, you know. It feels like you can barely move on the bike. They feel so slow and boring. The movement just feels boring. And as soon as you get back to Supercross 3, it's like, okay, here we go. Now we're talking, right? Supercross 3, you can whip. There's, you know, an actual whip system to this game versus just hitting a button and playing an animation. You can turn both your thumbsticks the same direction or opposite directions to whip. There's actually a hucking system to this game. I mean, there's no doubt about Supercross 3's actual physics and feeling on the bike is literally twice the level of any other Milestone game out there. There is no question about that in my mind. That's like a hands down. None of the other ones are even close. Like, I mean, they're starting to get to a point where it ain't even close anymore. Which ones are better at this point? Like, I would much rather play these Supercross games than the newer MXGP games. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with, you know, Supercross 4, and then when we get into the next MXGP game, I mean, it wouldn't shock me at all if they just completely quit making the MXGP games at this point, because there's no way in hell that MXGP 2020 sold even close to what Supercross 3 did. Like, I just don't believe that. I bet they're probably selling about half of the amount of copies with their MXGP games as they are with their Supercross games. I bet you Supercross 1 probably sold 4 times the amount of copies as MXGP Pro did. At least 4 times the amount of copies. Just with all the hype around that first Supercross game and everything, right? But it's just to the point now where it's like, not only that, but like now we're on what, MXGP 7 is what it would be. So we've already had 3 MXGP games before we ever even got to the Supercross game. So I feel like a lot of people are just kind of looking for that like official Lucas Oil Pro motocross game from Milestone. You know, people aren't even really so interested in the whole official MXGP game anymore. I feel like that whole vibe is kind of starting to die out a little bit. People are still interested in the Supercross games because we've only had 3 of them, and the fact that it's Supercross, and that's more of an American, you know, thing going on here, right? It's a lot easier to kind of connect with a Supercross game than it is with an MXGP game when you live in the United States, and you guys know how that is, right? I certainly think they would sell a shitload of copies with an official Lucas Oil Pro motocross game. Holy crap, man. That might actually top, I don't know if it would top the first Supercross game sales, but it would be up there. Like, if they came out with an official Lucas Oil Pro motocross game from Milestone, and it had like more of these like Supercross 3 physics and like 1.5 to 1 scaling tracks and all that type of shit, and an actual proper motocross track editor. That shit sends chills up my spine just thinking about a game like that. Oh man. An actual terrain deformation system that makes like grabbable ruts, like reflex and shit. If they came out with a game like that, I promise you it'd sell more than any of these other games since the first Supercross game. I promise you it'd do that. It would come close to how much the first Supercross game sold. So that's really the best thing they could do at this point. I know there's like all these legal things and, you know, you got to get licenses and all that kind of stuff, but I'm just saying, if there was a way for them to do that, that would 100% be the best possible thing they could be doing at this point. But, yeah, if you guys, just letting you know, if you want to make sure and get all of my videos notified to you, just make sure you got that notification bell turned on for YouTube. All you got to do is go to my front page. It's right beside the subscribe button. And all you got to do is hit the little notification bell. If you don't do that, you're only going to get like half of my notifications. So, yeah, just letting you know on that one. But, let's go to the old MXGP 2020 here. Man, now that I've went back and played all these games in a short succession, it really gives you a certain level of a, you know, outlook on a certain perspective on how all these games really are. Every time I've went back to any of these milestone games, the fun factor is basically cut in half on the actual MXGP games, right? Like going from the Supercross games back to the MXGP games, the fun factor is just cut in half from what it was in the Supercross game. And it just feels like slower, especially with MXGP 2019 and 2020. Those are the ones that's really started to go down that slow the gameplay down. Feels like you're just hitting this acceleration plateau. You know, it's cool and all if you want to make a slow game when you're going slow, but you don't want it to feel slow the whole time you're playing the game. You know, when you're going slow or medium or fast or whatever, it's just like so boring when it's like that. You know, I'm all good for it feeling slow when you're actually going slow, but like you got to have that actual, that's what I'm saying, you got to have that actual progression from going slow to fast, and it just doesn't have that in MXGP 2019 or MXGP 2020, and they just feel slow from the jump, right? So they just, and then it kind of creates that feeling of they just don't have the fun factor. The jumps are smaller than they are in the Supercross. The scaling feels smaller than it is in the Supercross games. The speed is slower. They're just not as fun. They're just not, they just don't feel as like there was as much work put into these MXGP games as there was the Supercross games. And of course, you got to directly compare to the one that you just had, because you would just expect the game to be at least as good as the Supercross game that you just had before, and I feel like none of these MXGP games have been able to live up to that. They just haven't yet. They've just felt like a one step forward, two steps backwards, you know. Obviously, the graphics are improving with every game, especially MXGP 2020. That's the part you can't let trick your ass up. Obviously, the graphics are improving, but, like, other than that, it's just like, oh my word. Oh my word. I just can't get over how boring and slow this feels right here compared to Supercross 3. Like, I 10 to 1 would rather play Supercross 3 than this right here. There's no doubt about it. But either way, man, that's basically the comparison between the two different types of milestone games. We'll see where they go in the future, but obviously, MXGP 1, 2, 3 was kind of its own little entity. But ever since that, these MXGP games have just been going downhill in comparison to the Supercross games, in my opinion. Like, the Supercross games are way more worth your money than these MXGP games. And it makes it all the worse when, you know, you just bought that Supercross game of that particular year, and then you go buy that MXGP game, and it's just like, I can't help but constantly get that feeling of like it's just a shittier version of It's a better graphic, shittier version of the Supercross game that you just had, 6 months before that MXGP game that came out. That's just what it feels like to me, and that's felt like that with all these newer MXGP games, especially MXGP 2019 and 2020. Obviously, MXGP Pro still had some fun factor and some skill gap and stuff, but it also had all the janky, weird, simulator arcade motocross game hybrid type shit where you pop off on every little 2-foot double and all that kind of weird filling, but at least it didn't feel as slow as MXGP 2019 and MXGP 2020, I feel like these MXGP games are just rapidly starting to go downhill, and they're going to have to do something with it, man. Something drastic. Yeah, they're making the graphics better, but that's only going to do so much, man. I'm telling you. So, either way, that's just my opinion when you compare these two different types of games. And, yeah, I think Supercross 4 is going to be pretty damn good. I got high hopes for that. We gon' see, bro. And I think the next MXGP game that they come out with is just going to be the same story. It's just going to be not as good as the, Supercross 4. It's probably going to be better graphics, but it's not going to be as good as Supercross 4. How could I not think like that when that's literally the way it's been for the past 3 years? How could I not think like that, right? I think it all comes down to that, just feels like it's two different development teams. I'm telling you, if it was the exact same, people working on the MXGP games that were working on the Supercross games, if it truly was that, you wouldn't see this bizarre, one step forward and 2 steps backwards to the gameplay with these MXGP games compared to the Supercross games. You wouldn't see that if this consistently with the past 3 years. You wouldn't see that if that wasn't the case. You know what I mean? It certainly feels to me like it's kind of different people working on the two different games, two different types of games. Even though it's in the same gaming company, it just feels to me like it's not the same people working on both of the different games. And I just think you're not getting the same level of experience with these MXGP games as you are with the Supercross games. So, either way, that's just my opinion on it, but appreciate you guys watching all the videos. Later, dudes.